So it's a pleasure to really have Adam join us for today's Luncheon Society. I met him through Alan when he joined us a couple of weeks ago for his call. You know, as I said, Felicia and I have given Adam's book to a number of to a number of surprised parents, and Go to Fuck to Sleep remains an international bestseller. It's the only book I know, the only children's book for tired parents that are, that really hits the mark that's out there. But during that time, as Adam's career was moving upward, he found himself dealing with what could only be called an unspeakable family tragedy. He received a phone call from his father, and then he had to come to terms with something that was just extraordinarily difficult. And I go back to this one line. Let's see if I have it here. He talks about how do you mourn somebody who chose not to live, and I think I'm paraphrasing it. And that hits you where you live. It just, we've had a friend of ours go through a suicide, and you spend years trying to figure out the why behind it. Yet when he did it in what could only be called a rational approach. He chose to leave, and I'm still 15 years later, I can't get my arms around it. And when I read Adam's poetic memoir, it's searing stuff. And so with that, we'll start with Adam with a reading, and after that, we'll just go to Q&A like we always do. And with that, Adam, you're up.
Right. Thanks for having me, everybody. It's good to see you all. Yeah, as Bob said, the book is called I Had a Brother Once. My brother committed suicide 10 years ago. And, in the ensuing years, I never really stopped thinking about how to write about this. It was never far from my mind, and I never so much as put a single word down on paper for 8 years. In that time, I wrote almost everything else there is to write. I wrote novels, I wrote screenplays, I wrote books with Zwei Bell to show you how low I sunk. But I could never wrap my mind around the form that this book or this project ought to take. I thought about writing a novel. I thought about writing a nonfiction piece. I even thought about writing a screenplay. And the architecture always stymied me. The question of how I would structure such a book, what it would be, what it would look like, stopped me before I started. And 2 years ago, I happened to be asked to write a poem for an event that SF Jazz was doing. My friend Mark Bamuti Joseph was curating an event where a bunch of poets were going to perform with a band, and he asked me to participate. And I hadn't written a poem in a very long time. The first book I ever wrote about 20 years ago was a book of poetry, and I literally may not have written more than 3 or 4 poems since. My career has gone in a bunch of different directions. Technically, Go the Fuck to Sleep is a poem. But poetry is not something that I usually think of as a primary form of expression. But the experience of writing a piece for this event and then spending the next week performing with a band and hanging out with a bunch of other poets, several of them close friends, sort of reminded me of how powerful that form can be at its best and how little scaffolding is involved in it. All the questions of form that had sort of been stopping me before I started sort of disappeared for me when I came back and sat down and began trying to write this piece as a poem. My brother would have turned 40 the week that I got off that gig and found myself sitting in this room. And once I started with no game plan, no map, I wrote the entire book in about 2.5 weeks in a kind of concentrated burst. I found myself making connections and learning things that I did not know, that I didn't know I felt, making connections between events and things that had happened in my brother's life and in my own mourning of him. Part of me didn't want this to ever stop. I didn't know when the book was going to end. I didn't know how it was going to end. I didn't know where it was going to go. And part of me wanted it to just keep going because I was letting so much loose, and it was so cathartic to be writing it. And another part of me couldn't wait to finish because it was so draining. And yeah, when it was all said and done, I had this book in this form that I never expected to write in. But poetry is very liberating. You can move from idea to idea and scene to scene with kind of minimal scaffolding. I was able to write fast enough to keep up with the processing of ideas that was accompanying the manifestation of the book. And you can sort of connect thoughts and ideas simply by proximity, which I found very kind of helpful as well as I embarked on this thing. My brother died just as Go the Fuck to Sleep was about to be published. So complicating the grief that I was dealing was was the fact that I was sort of toggling between this very public sort of performance of success and surprise and joy, and this private shock and grief, which was dizzying to say the least. So anyway, I'll read briefly from the book, and then we can just have a conversation. I'm going to pick up at the moment when my father calls me to tell me that David has taken his life. It's 12:30. I'm DJing at a nightclub in Philadelphia, which is very unusual for me. I'd usually be in bed 99 times out of 100, but I happen to be out playing music at a club. My father's sentence was unrecognizable, a cluster of words spinning in a void. The notion that it was all a mistake flashed through me and fell instantly to ash. No parent would say such a thing about his child to his child if there was any hope. And here begins a different kind of struggle on this page, akin to keeping the steering wheel perfectly straight, a struggle not to crane out of this shot, not to add voiceover, not to do the one thing I am trained to, which is make things legible, impose structure and plot, motivation, a frame, a double helix of narrative to snake through the spine, to be the spine. Here I am, here we are, not 50 feet from the news of my brother's suicide, and already I can feel a tug at the reins. I don't know if naming these things can sap their power or if it constitutes a sacrifice at their altar, an invitation to the impulse I am trying to disperse. What are the rules of this endeavor? Am I supposed to unfold this night like an origami crane, crease by crease? Is that the penance or the healing, the ritual, a march toward or away from what? Penance for what? If you were making up the ritual as you go, is it a ritual? If the loss is a hole that cannot be filled, is the remainder of your life the ritual? Are rituals supposed to fill the hole or deepen it until you can crawl out the other side? And who am I that I have to ask? My mother's father's parents were the children of famed rabbis. They came here and founded a Jewish community in Burlington, Vermont, by paying other Jews to keep the Sabbath, making them whole and a minion by handing out the wages they would have lost in observing the holy day. And here I am, not even 150 years later, acting as if the books my people carried and died for are unknown to me. Here I am, freighted by nothing, reinventing the wheel, reinventing the rack, daring to believe that perhaps you only realize a ritual was one after you complete it. Inscribe the final character. A tear falls on the page, becomes the final period, or some stupid maudlin shit like that. The final moment is what I dwell on most. He is sitting in his Subaru, overlooking nothing, the ass end of a parking lot, the chemicals he will mix into the gas that kills him lying in his lap, knowing he is one breath away, that he could end it all right now, though any of us could really. It is always right now. There are always heights and cars, things to fling yourself off or in front of. There is always a drawer full of knives. I imagine he is crying, but that is only because I would be. Perhaps he is laughing or luxuriating in the sudden, vivid crispness of the world, the miraculous dispersal of cumulonimbus formations in a southwesterly wind, and feeling free at last. Or just as likely, he is stone-faced with determination, so close, just one final push. Perhaps the act was a ritual, a series of gestures rehearsed and enacted with faithful, reverent precision. The implements delicate in his large hands like eyedroppers, carrot peelers. It is all unfathomable. I cannot place myself in him. I'm throwing cliches at the wall. They say a velvet calm descends when people have decided, gathered their supplies, chosen a place, an hour. Their moods lighten, and their loved ones think they've turned a corner, which they have, a different corner. But in my head, that's where he always is, sitting in his car with me screaming, "Don't do it," from the back seat like some spirit cursed to be unheard. And my mother's father's parents, the famous rabbi's kids, the minion makers of Burlington, Vermont, they squat atop the glass floor of the distant beyond, shaking their great woolly heads and asking why, of all things, did it have to be gas?
That was the one grouping, I guess. It was probably that was the most affecting. For me, that last sentence just really just hit you home, hit you where you live. And what we'll do, since in the chat section, so we're not talking over each other, just put your name in the chat section, and we'll use that as a cue, and we'll kind of go from there. And I'll start off first. Walk us through how you memorialize your brother. How do you balance that within the structure of the poem, memorializing your brother, trying to find meaning of what took place, and kind of tying it all together? I mean, poetry gives you the real estate to do that in a way a memoir or something else does not. But how do you tie together your ability to try to grasp and understand what he's doing to the love that you have, because it's evident throughout?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I sort of touched on in that excerpt just now, a big struggle for me, both on the pages of this book and in the ensuing 10 years since my brother passed, is kind of grappling with the dueling impulses to consecrate a narrative, to tell a story, both as a storyteller and as a human being, right? This is what we do. We tell stories.
Right.
There's the feeling that my brother was more afraid to tell his story than he was to kill himself. That if he had chosen not to be silent about the pain he was going through, perhaps he would still be alive. There's that piece. There's the impulse to want to figure this out, to tell the story, which is in conflict with the fact that I know that I won't ever know the story, and that the more I repeat one version of it, the more that becomes the story and sort of boxes out the other equally plausible and equally unknowable alternatives. So there's my desire to tell the story, my reticence to claim the authority to tell the story. There's the conflicted feeling of sort of being out here in the world telling these other stories during the time when I couldn't figure out how to tell this one, desperately wanted to, wasn't sure whether it was obscurely disrespectful to claim that authority or more disrespectful not to try. So it's all very gnarled for me, and a lot of it in writing this book is sort of figuring out what to do with these various paradoxes that animate my brother's life and death for me, and partly learning to get to a point where paradox doesn't have to feel like something to resolve, but merely something to kind of hold. you know, this is an unknowable act for me. I cannot relate. I'm lucky enough not to be able to understand suicide or my brother's choice to take his own life. But you know, there were a number of things that ate at me. Like my brother ordered an expensive skateboard, which hadn't even been delivered to his house when he died. So it's like part of him was planning to live and skateboard, and part of him was simultaneously planning to die. And at first glance, that seems like, you know, a clue. If this was a TV show, that would be the thing the detective finds and seizes on and unravels the mystery. And you know, it's a process to learn that, like, it's not resolvable, it's not contradictory. My brother was merely planning both these things at once. In the book, I think I say something like, it's no more a paradox than a train station with two sets of tracks running in opposite directions. So you know, there's all of that. There's working through all of these sort of gnarled and intertwined feelings and thoughts, and trying to, yeah, trying to get it down on paper.
Wow. Alan, you're up. Alan Zweibel.
Yeah, I may have a different perspective on Adam and this whole thing than anybody else on right now, because when I read the book and listening to Adam now and listening to the excerpt, I scroll backwards. Adam and I met maybe 10 years ago, 9 years ago now. Okay. And we met at the book fair in Arizona. We hit it off. We decided we would write together. So we wrote two middle grade books together. And we also co-wrote with Dave Barry two other books. So I've been involved with Adam for 4 books now, which not only was the trading of chapters of funny writing, but what was most fun about it was a book tour. And we would go to all these cities, either Adam and myself or the three of us, when the three of us wrote a book together. And it was really funny. And you know, we keep on saying that we want to keep writing together, if for no other reason that we can go on tour and have fun. I didn't know any of this. I knew him as this really funny, really smart guy. I knew about Go to Fuck to Sleep. I sought him out at the Arizona Book Fair. But as I go back through the calendar, your brother's passing, your brother's suicide was really fresh. And in all the 10 years that I've known you, this never came up. I think there may have been one time when we were in Florida doing book tour down there and we took a walk on the beach. It may have come up that you had a brother who died. So when I read this book, I'm going, wow, all during this, and that, all these years, this was inside Adam. This was waiting to come out somehow, some way. I don't know if you shared it with Jamie or certain people who were closer to you than I am, but for something like this to have occurred and percolate, and you being so functional, especially in the area of comedy, both written and performed, the compartmentalizing of it is something that astounds me. And I understand the need to write about it. I mean, many of us maybe on this Zoom today have written memoirs. I did one about my friend Gilda Radner, but that was a slow turn. Somebody had cancer. You were prepared for it. Yeah, it was a shock. It was grief and all of that. But yeah, cancer, you die from. You don't get a phone call from your father saying that your brother took his life. So I find myself, Adam, looking at you now, whenever we talk on the phone, because we're thinking of this new project together, it's now in my brain that Adam went through this. I read the book twice, and it's incredibly well written. You're incredibly in touch with it and the feelings of it. But I guess I applaud you for being able to have Jamie, have your children, have your career. You're writing a movie for for Andy Samberg. So this is all comedy stuff while this was lurking. So it's not a question, anybody. It's a comment. You know, I I um I find myself astounded by the whole phenomenon.
And the follow-up with Alan's question would be, did comedy help as an emotional outlet as you were trying to come to terms with your emotional reality?
I think staying busy
Yeah.
certainly was an outlet, was a coping mechanism. I didn't make a conscious decision to do comedy. Comedy is just fundamentally my worldview. Um, even in this fairly, dark and and grueling book, there are jokes. There are funny observations. There are things that I'm not imposing on the narrative. I'm just recalling them because they were in my mind as it took place. Um, we need comedy most, I think, in our darkest moments. And this may be related to the reason that some of our funniest stand-ups and writers are so fundamentally fucked up and depressed. Um, I certainly made an effort to keep busy. I mean, the book came out the Go the Fuck to Sleep came out 2 weeks after my brother died. Um, and so at that moment, and it was a very strange process. That the way that book happened is very unusual, sort of unlike maybe the way any other book has ever happened, in that, I did that book with a small independent publisher called Akashic Books in Brooklyn, New York. Their motto is reverse gentrification of the literary world. So you can tell they're like a real commercial dynamo. The book was supposed to come out in October, but in April of 2011, I did a reading of the book at a museum in Philadelphia where I was living at the time. I was actually living in the museum. And from that initial reading, the book kind of took off. The pre-order page was up on Amazon. So by the end of that week, the book was #1 on Amazon, based just on sort of viral word of mouth. And it stayed at #1 for weeks and weeks and weeks as we frantically rushed to get the book out in time for Father's Day in June. And so there was this tremendous kind of run up to publication. And the book was still #1 on Amazon when it was published and remained there for months and months afterward. So there was kind of a frenzy around it. In that time, all the major publishing houses tried to buy it from Akashic. We were fielding all these crazy offers. We sold the movie rights. Sam Jackson did the audiobook, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was, up until that point, I'm a literary novelist. Like, nothing like this has ever happened to me before. I didn't even know that numbers on Amazon could be less than 5 or 6 digits, So I'm dealing with this crazy situation, and my brother dies, and then I sort of have to make an immediate decision about whether I'm going to engage with the world, do all of the things that are expected of me, which at this point means like going on the Today Show and promoting the book and going on an extensive tour. We sell the book in 45 different languages. So I have to make a decision whether, in this sort of crazed, fragile state of grief and disbelief and shock, I want to engage with media from around the world. And I decided that I should. And, this was a fraught decision for me because, on one hand, I wanted to do it. I felt like this was a singular opportunity. If I could provide the book with the rocket fuel that it needed to sort of reach orbit, it might sort of change my family's life forever. My parents and my extended family were sort of looking to me to see how I was going to play this. And they very much wanted me to do all these things because it was proof that life would, in some form or fashion, continue. And then there was my own ambition to contend with. I wanted the success. I wanted the book to do whatever it could. But every time I sat down to do an interview, I also felt guilty, like it was a betrayal of my brother. Like this was proof of the very thing he had told himself, which was that we'd all be okay without him, that he didn't matter that much, that life would continue. So it was a double-edged sword. And I found myself also like wearing a mask, you know. And I thought a lot about the idea of masks in my life and in my brother's life. My brother wore a mask to disguise his depression. And now, immediately after his death, here I was voluntarily putting on a mask so that I could show the face to the world that was required of me as I promoted my ridiculous, obscene, fake children's book for the next year and a half. And that, you know, so all of this was very strange and fraught for me, even as I soldiered on and like did it all. So, you know, writing, staying active, doing comedy, all these things, yeah, were essential. But, you know, as Alan was saying, you know, Alan is a good friend of mine. I love Alan. I love Dave Barry. And I spent an incredible amount of time with these guys. And the entire time, you know, we went on multiple book tours. We stayed in hotels together. We, you know, ate breakfast and dinner together every day for like weeks at a time. And there was always this part of me that was looking for the opening and wanting to let them know this fact about myself, particularly since it's something Dave has also dealt with. Dave's mother, you know, died this way. But it's like, it was such a difficult thing for me to tell people. I found myself in the paradox of wanting everybody to know, wanting all my friends to know, but not wanting to be the one who told them. And with new people who came into my orbit after he died, they weren't on any of the phone trees. They hadn't received the information. So it was incumbent on me to figure out a time and a place that was appropriate. And one of the things about suicide is it's such a particular type of grief. It's so different than any other. It's sort of, there are no inroads to it. Like nothing else gets you into that conversation. Not conversations about death, not conversations about depression. It's a very difficult thing, at least for me, to sort of figure out how to organically bring up. So it took me a very long time. And that, you know, I think I told Alan in Florida after this book had been written and was like forthcoming. And I told Dave in an email when I was like, hey, you want to do a book event for me with this book I have coming out? I wrote this book. Here's what it's about. Never mentioned this until now. Sorry about that. So how about it? 2 weeks, you and me, books and books in Miami, you know, awkward at best. But yeah, I for a long time really would do anything to avoid having to break the news. And because I was around so many new people and I was promoting Go the Fuck to Sleep and I was traveling, I was always around new people. And I got very good at seeing where a conversation was going to go, knowing that in 3 minutes, it was going to turn toward family and somebody was going to ask an innocuous question. Oh, do you have any siblings? And figuring out a way to redirect the conversation before it even got to that point. So I wouldn't have to make a spot decision and say, yeah, I had a brother, you know, but he died. Or sometimes I found myself just saying, yeah, I'm an only child. Or, you know, there's a time that I talk about in the book where it was an event that was being thrown by somebody that I had gone to high school with. I didn't really know them very well, but I knew that they knew I had a brother. I think this person was closer in age to my brother. I knew it was going to come up. And all night I tried to avoid it. And eventually she said, how's Dave doing? And I said, he's great. He lives in Brookline with his wife. And I never stopped feeling guilty about saying that. So, you know, it got easier as time went on. At this point, 10 years out and having written this book, things have kind of come full circle. I spent a lot of time trying to avoid talking about it, and now I'm very publicly and very willingly talking about it in the hopes that, you know, the book and the experiences I've gone through can be helpful to other folks who've experienced some kind of loss. And also in the weird situation where, due to this pandemic, the same way that a lot of us, the same way that suicide sort of denies you a lot of the rituals that we usually have to comfort us, because, you know, it's hard to figure out how to mourn for somebody who chose to leave. It's hard to celebrate the life of somebody who decided their life wasn't worth living. These things estrange you from the rituals of death. And in the past year and a half, everybody who's lost people, we've all been denied some of those rituals. You know, many of us have not been able to attend a funeral, have not been able to sit Shiva, have not been able to hug somebody in the aftermath of a loss. So in a weird way, the weird experience of going through a suicide has shaded more toward the universal, because COVID era grief is weird in its own right.
Wow. And with that, we'll go to Barbara. Barbara, you're up. You're on mute.
Yes, so I was crying when you were reading, and I feel very lucky to be here. I was telling Bob that I'm a poet and performer, sort of stand-up memoir, and a teacher. And our son died when he was 39 at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's not clear how he died. His leg was amputated. He had fevers. He was talking to me about it, and he says, "I'm sick." And I was teaching, and I said, "I'm going to fly down there, you know." And I got a call from the policeman, and my last talk with him was, he said, "I can't breathe. I have to get off the fucking phone, you know." And he didn't wake up. And whatever he had given himself to get through this, he probably had COVID. His heart stopped. So he died alone. And I'm a writer, as I said. And I was telling Bob, I kept teaching. I have a book that's out this week. It's called Here for the Present, How to Make the Present Moment a Gift. And I haven't been able to write about it at all. And your work, your book, your presentation here, it's such a gift. And it's given me a sense of hope that there will be a time I'm going to be able to figure out how to write about this, what to say about it. And I was so struck when you read, you talked about poetry. This was rhetorical rap. It was lyric energy. It was gorgeous writing. It was exquisitely crafted, every single phrase. It had so much vibration in it. It was so vibrant. It was so lively and creative. It just leaps at you. It's moving, but it is, in a curious way, it's lyrically joyous, celebrating how words can be used musically, imaginatively, creatively. I was thinking of Hamilton. I was thinking of this on stage. It was so lively, and it really showcased the artist making of life something that is comic and tragic and beautiful. It's beautifully written and so moving. So you have inspired me, and I just thank you for this great gift to us.
Wow. Thank you. That's so wonderful to hear. And I'm sorry to hear about your son, and I hope that you will find the words at some point. it certainly took me a long time.
Yeah. Well, what made you after 10 years? I mean, what was it that made you say, you said you did it in 2.5 weeks, yeah, and your beginning is so amazing. What inspired that?
I think it was a couple of things. I mean, I think partly I had just gotten to the point where I was ready. Um,
Okay.
I think the experience of spending that week with a bunch of poets performing,
Yeah.
and
That.
it really reminded me of how powerful poetry could be. Um, it also took me back to a kind of a place of tremendous comfort in my life, which is jazz clubs. I
Okay.
spent I spent 7 years as a roadie for the jazz drummer Elvin Jones,
Okay.
who was John Coltrane's drummer throughout the 60s. So the experience of hanging out with a bunch of musicians is a very comforting and familiar one. And then when that week ended, it was the week my brother would have turned 40. So,
Right.
birthdays and anniversaries are incredibly difficult. I think, the body really remembers. I often feel like I would not need a calendar to know when when the date of his birth, the date of his death, when they're approaching, you feel it. You feel it intuitively, instinctively. You feel it in the air. You feel it in the pollen count. So him turning 40 was really that really hit me hard, and I think inspired me to just sit down and try. But the idea of doing it in verse also was extremely liberating. It's not something that had occurred to me until it occurred to me.
Mhm.
And it really freed me up to say only what I wanted to say, to not psych myself out in thinking about plot and structure and character and scaffolding, but to just sort of go. And you can accumulate pages quickly. You can push off from the shore very quickly in poetry. You
Yeah.
know, you can amass a number of words or a number of pages that lets you say, okay, I'm now somewhere in the middle of this thing. I'm not in the initial stages anymore. I'm not still writing the first scene. I'm off. And I was able to get to that point quickly enough and build enough momentum
Yeah, you did.
that I just kind of kept going, and also figure a lot of things out as I went along, which was astounding to me. In the excerpt that I read, for example, and it sounds ludicrous. I mean, it sounds ridiculous that in 8 years of contemplating every aspect of what happened, I had never made the connection between the fact that my brother, who was a scientist,
Mm.
killed himself by ordering these two gases online. They were delivered to his home. He sat in his car, he mixed them together, he took a breath, and his life ended painlessly. The idea of connecting that in the way that I did on the page to the fact that my family is Jewish and that gas is a particularly fucked up way, like that had never occurred to me. Like, I mean, that and that sounds crazy to me now that had never occurred to me. But only in the writing did I make certain connections, and that was one of them, among many, many others. The information about my mother's father's parents, etc., being these rabbis, was something I had learned recently. The story about them moving from like Russia or Lithuania, depending on what year the census is taken, to Burlington, Vermont, and establishing a community by paying other Jews to like keep the Sabbath, is something that my father has a friend who's a genealogist. I happened to be home 6 months before I started writing this book, flipping through this book that my father's friend had compiled. And I was like, holy shit, that's an incredible, hilarious fact, particularly for a family that at this point has not set foot in a synagogue in more than 100 years. I was never, Alan knows all this already. my engagement with the Jewish community consists primarily of writing humor books about Judaism. I was never bar mitzvahed. I'm still like a very elderly boy in the eyes of the Jewish world. But you know, this nugget had been made available to me, you know, so yeah, the book was sort of this totalizing process of pulling in all of these stories, all this information. I mean, it's very much a book about my brother and about me, but I end up telling a lot of other stories in the book as well. And in the process of writing it, it was a very, very intuitive process. I didn't know where I was going, but I trusted the process. One of the stories I tell in the book, for example, is about the last time that Elvin Jones ever played the drums. I happened to be there for that. It was an incredibly moving experience. I found myself writing that story into the book without knowing why.
Mm.
And until I got to the end of that long section and figured it out, and it's only a couple of lines that sort of connect that story to my brother's story, I didn't know what they were going to be until I got there. There are a lot of moments in the book that unfolded that way to me. I was like, I instinctually know that this should be here. I don't know how it's going to tie in. And only when I get there and sort of stick the landing, or at least try to stick the landing, am I like, oh, that's why. That's how it fits in. That's how this patchwork narrative collage is going to be constructed. So I just, yeah, it was a very different process for me than anything else I've ever written.
So if I were going to be writing about this, which I am going to write about what you're saying. I profess poetry. I have a poetry show. But what I understand is actually what you've written is music. And if you look at a symphony, if you look at the various, the refrains, and this comes in and this comes in, but this is where you have made music. You've made jazz. You've made a jazz symphony in this book. It's fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, for me, there's no higher compliment than anybody comparing anything I might do to something as sophisticated and soulful as jazz. And I did think a lot about music. You know, I always think a lot about music when I'm writing, and you know, about rhythm and about tone color and about soloing and about improvisation and about themes. So
yes,
you know, I don't tend to drill down too specifically on those concepts. Like it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, but those things do tend to be in my mind. And some of the most fascinating conversations that I've ever had about craft have been with musicians. I tend to spend a lot of time with musicians. When I was Elvin's roadie, I would have these incredible conversations where I would like, you know, be in the cab on the way to the hotel from the airport with, you know, the bass player or the pianist, and be like, okay, tell me everything you think about soloing. Give me your whole philosophy of soloing. And they'd be like, can I just take a nap? I'd be like, no. So
that's fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, we'll move on to Linda Levy and Sandra Barkin. If you have a question, just put your name in the comment section. And thanks so much for that great question, Barbara. Thank you so much. Linda Levy, you're up. And you are probably on mute. You are. You're on mute, Linda. There you go.
Thank you, Barbara, also for your eloquent sharing. Adam, it was a riff. Barbara said it so eloquently. You riffed. There was so much syncopation. It was so alive. I can't say more about that. Taking 10 years, I can't imagine. My brother died 13 years ago. And I couldn't do anything else but think about it and why and anger and just a force within me I couldn't get rid of. So to wait 10 years, I'm imagining it lived inside of you somewhere. And of course, as a therapist, I'm thinking, what was your relationship with him? And, you know, how that was able to affect you and protecting yourself, you know, obviously from whatever your pain might have looked like. And there's, I think also with suicide, there's a lot of shame. And, you know, you want to kind of keep that to yourself. And people say, well, how did, you know, the first thing, well, what happened? How they, oh, well, you know. So I don't know if any of that played into your reasoning and thoughtful.
Yeah, thank you. I think, I mean, the idea of shame is definitely one that sort of tumbles through the book in different ways. Not my shame at the fact that my brother killed himself, but the shame over his depression that meant more seemingly to him than almost anything else. And where that shame comes from and what can be done to destigmatize that shame. You know, I spend a lot, I mean, it's interesting, like depression runs in families. Depression runs in my family. My brother is far from the only person in our family who has grappled with depression. My grandfather, my grandmother on the other side, various cousins, aunts, uncles, almost, and so, and this was, you know, none of this was a secret. And yet for him, it was of the utmost importance that no one should know. He swore his wife to secrecy. He told her that, you know, anybody that she told about what he was going through, he would never speak to them again. Which operates in so many odd ways, right? Like I didn't know, and my not knowing is very thorny because on one hand, it kind of gives me a reprieve from feeling guilty because I didn't, you know, guilty for not doing anything. Like I should have done more. Well, I literally didn't know. And then there's the part of me that, you know, can't help but imagine what would have happened if I did know, or what would have happened if he'd been willing to articulate this thing again, to tell his story. You know, and I think at the same time, my family's relationship with depression is such that we have long considered it to be something that you live with, not something that can kill you, because we've watched so many people sort of shoulder it but continue on. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to that idea, I think, of shame, and I think a lot, and I write a lot in this book about my children. You know, I look at them, I think about them, I think about what they may or may not have inherited and what I want for them, what I can do for them. And it really comes down more than anything else to wanting them to have the language, should they need it, that my brother David never had. So yeah, I think shame is very important as something to think about and push back against as we sort of grapple with what mental health looks like in this world.
Thank you.
Sandra, you're up. Sandy Barkin, you're up.
First of all, just let me say thank you, Adam, that what you wrote and then the ensuing conversation has been very powerful. I think um, I have found that if you scratch almost any family, any friend, and that you have, there is mental illness. And this whole discussion of shame that you were just launching, as it were, is very much part of what the National Alliance on Mental Illness is interested in now. And I'm just, you know, it sounds to me, and I've only heard you now speak about this and read that segment. I haven't read the whole work, but it sounds to me like what you have written would be something very, very valuable for NAMI to have and to be able to use. And I'm hoping that you will in some way make them both aware of it and share that and um, uh, do something with it, because what you're talking about is indeed I mean, we're just listening to how many people on this conversation have, including myself, have family members who have suffered from. I mean, I listened to you talk about ordering gas and at the same time a very elegant skateboard. Sounds like manic depression to me. And what do I know? But I wonder if you've talked to a psychologist about all of this. Maybe I'll just
Um,
put it there.
yeah, I have, I have a bit. It's interesting. I mean, I mean, again, during the year and a half after David's death, I look, it's funny. I look at my date book, my planner for that time, and I realize that I was never in one city for more than about 4 or 5 days at a time. I was constantly traveling. And when I came home, I would just kind of like collapse until it was time to go out again. But my life was so hectic that during that time, I didn't see a therapist. I remember going to see somebody for a couple of sessions and telling him one of the things I had sort of internalized, which was not very helpful, was the idea that that there was a right and proper way to grieve, and that if you didn't grieve fully, if you grieved sort of incompletely, that grief would sort of go off and hide and gain, and like lift weights and drink protein shakes and get stronger and more fearsome and kind of return and come back for you. And then if that happened, you were going to be helpless against it. Like if you didn't fully address your grief immediately or in the ensuing months, then like this grief monster was going to come back for you. And so I remember going to a therapist and being like, am I grieving correctly? Am I doing it right? Because again, I come from a very secular family. We didn't have at our disposal easy access to the rituals that some folks do to sustain them in these moments. I say in the book something like, we were sitting Shiva but did not know how. Instead of covering the mirrors, we became them. And I remember like this fear gripping me that I was not grieving right. And this therapist being like, you sound like you're doing everything, it sounds okay to me, like I don't know what to tell you. But and if there's anything that I would sort of do differently, it would be to not indulge in that particular fear or self criticism that like there is a right and a wrong way, and if I do it wrong, I'm gonna screw myself. That said, I probably haven't availed myself to as much counseling as I ought to have in the in the time since. I'm looking at okay, I'll thank you, Linda, for the DM. I'd love that.
So I'll ask the next question. I'll focus really on the role of our or the role of our unconscious. I mean, for 10 years, roughly 10 years, there was a period between the time the event took place and the time that you were able to write this in a 2.5 week or 2.5 month period.
Half week, more like.
So what do you account for that? Is it, some mystics may say that it took time for the words to find their right place, or it was just time. Walk me through that piece of it. I mean, it came out, it sounds like it came out in full form.
I mean, I don't want to be too romantic about it. I mean, it's not like there was not a revision process. Of course there was, but that revision process was mostly a process of addition. I wrote a draft of the book. I was working really almost like to the exclusion of all else.
Mhm.
I hate when artists like mystify their process or make it sound all romantic or lie about it. Like I feel like a giant disservice is done to everybody else who's out here trying to create work. When like Jack Kerouac claims he wrote On the Road in like one, methamphetamine fueled binge on a roll of butcher paper, or Jay-Z talks about how he never writes rhymes. He just goes in the, what, like there's all this mystification, and it's usually in service of artists claiming that they don't have a process. And, I very much do have a process. It just so happens that in this instance, my process unfolded with a lot of speed. In some sense, it took me 2.5 weeks to write the book. In another sense, it took me like 8.5 years to write the book. I do write fast. I'm a novelist by trade. So whenever I'm doing anything else, it tends to go quickly. This is my gift as a screenwriter or a humor writer. Compared to the world building of a novel, everything else feels relatively quick to me. And I enjoy working with that kind of speed. I don't know. In this case, it was sort of a floodgate opening kind of a feeling. Like there was a lot there. There were a lot of thoughts that I was sort of consecrating. There was a lot that I was drawing in. And I worked long days. I sat in this room at this desk listening to records. I have a lot of them behind me here. And, crying and trusting where I was going and that I would get there. And also like constantly fucking with my line breaks and redoing them. The book is written in generally in extremely long stanzas. Like, they just kind of like go on and on. Like there often aren't breaks in the stanzas for 10, 15, 20 pages, which consequently means that if you break one line differently, everything else changes too. So the only, it was mostly forward motion, except where I was like, shit, I want this line to break here, which means the next 400 lines have to potentially break differently. It's a little bit of that too.
Now, I guess the follow-up would be this. Is it more cathartic written or spoken?
It's interesting. I mean, after I finished the book, after I sold the book, and I also only sent the book to one editor, my friend Chris Jackson, who's the editor-in-chief of One World, who is an old friend and somebody I've written published 2 novels with, and somebody who I consider to be an incredibly smart and sensitive editor of words on the page. Like he's made my books better over the years, and I really trust him. And I felt that this was not a book where I wanted to get to know a new editor. So he's the only guy I sent it to, and luckily he wanted to buy it. After the book was done and before lockdown began, I had very ambitious plans about how I wanted to tour the book. I saw myself reading the entire book, which only takes maybe about an hour, in front of audiences, like in its entirety, with sort of light sprinklings of sonic and visual accoutrements, some projections, some musical or audio cues. I had the idea of touring it, not as a play, but as something you could do in theater spaces, something you could do at the Kennedy Center or at PS1 or whatever. Because I did feel like that was an important way for me. I felt like that was going to be a powerful way to like connect with audiences. So the pandemic made all of that impossible. However, I did do an audio book with musical accompaniment. A friend of mine created the soundscape for it, and he and I sort of worked closely to get that right, and that's out. So that's sort of and also in retrospect, when I sat down to record the audiobook, I was like choking up every 5 minutes and, reading half of the book through like sobs and tears. So maybe it would have been an unbearable experience for anybody to like come and see me perform this book live. That sounds like a lot to ask of an audience. And on the flip side, there's a part of me that doesn't want to become so inured to the content of the book that I don't choke up when I read it, you know? As you can see, this notion of paradox extends so far that I am sitting here like talking myself out of a non-existent book tour. So there's that.
Okay, let's see who's next. I think Linda, you had a statement. Is that a question, or did Linda might have dropped off?
I'm
Who's
here.
next?
I don't.
I'm
I think
sorry.
I don't know what I did.
Well, just go ahead and verbalize it.
I said my piece. Thank you.
Okay. Who's next? Terry, you're up. You're on mute. You're still on mute. Or at least we're not hearing you. You might be on mute with your
Bye, Lena. Bye. Thank you. Thank you for everything.
try it again. Well, we'll come back to her in a second. And the follow-up from my earlier question was, you know, when we had something like this in our family, it was a little different, and it was more of a slow motion suicide, alcoholism. And it's interesting how I think of my cousin today. Is he's alive in me without the pain and sadness that he carried. I mean, where are you with your brother now? And then I think we'll go to Terry.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few answers to that. I mean, for me, one of the most tricky and insidious elements of suicide for me is the way that it kind of rewrites everything you thought you knew about your relationship with the person. There are things I thought I knew, assumptions I made, connections I thought my brother and I shared. The act of suicide forces you to sort of go back and look at that life in a different light and reconsider so many things. You know, photographs look different now, you know, like, you know, he used to be looking at the camera. Now he appears to be gazing beyond it into the horizon, you know, things like that. So, I mean, part of the process has been sort of trying to rethink and reconstruct so much of what I thought I knew about him. And that's tricky. That's, again, not something you can ever find definitive answers to. The process of writing this book has changed my relationship with him also. It's in some ways put my life and my sort of work-life balance back in balance. Because I spent a lot of time and energy like castigating myself for writing everything but this. All the work I was doing in these ensuing 8 years, on one hand, I found rewarding and fun and interesting. And on the other hand, it all seemed kind of like light and facile because it all seemed like I was doing it in avoidance of writing this book.
Right.
And now that I've written this book, I no longer feel that way. I don't feel guilty that I'm like writing an Andy Samberg movie. I mean, not that I would have felt guilty anyway, but it's different. The anniversary of his death is a lot easier for me to face now, because I feel like I've done my work, some of my work. You know, that used to be something that I dreaded from weeks out and never knew what to do with myself on that day. And it felt like whatever decision I made was the wrong one. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to be alone, I'm going to be with people. As soon as the day came, it was always like, shit, I made the wrong decision again. And now I have a sense of calm on that day that I didn't have before. I've got a picture of my brother over here on the bookcase that I didn't have before, that like, I wasn't able to like look at him every day. And now I feel like I want to. The book existing in the world is different for me. It makes it different for me. I think it makes it different for my parents too, you know, in ways that are good and bad, complicated and simple. But yeah, it's made a, writing this book has been the single biggest change for me in my relationship to my brother's death in these 10 years, more so than the sort of the slow healing that time provides, although that's also real, very real for me. Actually writing this book, I think for me has been more transformative. Not that everything is better, not that this book is like a happy ending to this process or anything, but yeah, it's what I needed to do, I think, on some level.
Wow. So we'll go to Terry and then we'll wrap off with Melanie Shardoff. So Terry, are you able to get back on? You're still on mute.
Let's see. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I have a weird setup here at my office, so sorry about that. Adam, I have not had an opportunity yet to read the book, but I'm really looking forward to reading it. It sounds wonderful. My first husband actually died by suicide, and you know, and you know, years earlier than that, my mother had died of cancer, and it's just such a different experience of, you know, a loved one dying in that way. So, you know, I really can relate to what you were saying about that. You know, what I learned at the time that it happened, I read everything I could about it. You know, I really tried to inform myself. And some of his relatives did the exact opposite. They didn't want to engage at all. They didn't want to go for therapy. They didn't want to read about it. They just, you know, it was really total avoidance. And, you know, I really didn't want to be judgmental about that at all. You know, everybody you know, reacts differently. But what distressed me as time went on was just that I started to feel like there are so many misconceptions about suicide. And, you know, that people don't always see it in the context of mental illness. And that there's almost like you know, they're taking what they're seeing from, you know, like what I would think of as a Hollywood version, you know, of what can lead to it, you know, and that I found myself really becoming very distressed by that. And that was part of my motivation sometimes to not talk about it, because I didn't want those weird reactions that I was getting, where I would then have to be in a role of, you know, then trying to like teach people. But over the years, then I came to see, well, no, if you're upset by people having misconceptions, then you do have to talk about it, right? And you do have to try to allay those. So it's, you know, it's kind of complicated. And I just wondered if you'd experienced that, and if, you know, in writing the book and getting people's reactions to it, if you felt like there was some, you know, progress in kind of, you know, turning around those kinds of misconceptions.
You know, another aspect of publishing this book during the pandemic is that instead of me being at a bookstore and meeting people who have been through something like this in person, I've been meeting them virtually. I've been getting emails from them. So it's been really astounding, because, as you say, one of the things about suicide is it's so isolating, and it's very easy to feel like nobody you know has been through it. And I've met more people who've been through it since publishing this book than in the 10 years leading up to the publishing of this book. So I've been hearing a lot of different experiences, all of them, you know, grueling and intense. But I think if there's a common thread, it's been a profound sense of understanding of the people, at least, who are reaching out to me. I feel like they are very sensitive to the mental illness aspect and how that has, you know, caused them to lose their loved ones. I do feel like there is a growing understanding and a move away from, as you say, the sort of like the Hollywood version of what leads somebody to kill themselves. Yeah, you know, like mental health is obviously always a factor, and I do want to hope, and I do feel like there is a growing understanding of that, you know, particularly as we grapple with like rises in all kinds of mental illness and rises, unfortunately, in suicide in this pandemic moment, right? Particularly among young people. So yeah, I have been encouraged, I would say, by the perspective that I'm seeing people bring to the topic.
That's good to hear. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we'll go with Melanie, or you'll have the last question. We'll wrap things up. You're on mute, dear. You're still on mute. Melanie, you're on mute. Hold on. There we go. Perfect.
I'm sorry, I haven't been familiar with your work, but I'm about to get familiar with your work. And I guess to get to the bottom of it, for me, I've only experienced one suicide of a dear friend, and it's still in my solar plexus. All I do is think of his face, and I'm clutching here again. And I think his 1,000 best friends also have that clutching, and it feels like punishment. It's really punishing. But you've done so much with your pain here, and I was wondering, do you think you'd need to be in this sort of anguish again to write another verse, poem, story like this? Does it require that for you?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in the process of writing this, I sort of fell in love with this form, and I'm working on something else that is in this sort of like long form memoir in verse format. It's very different than this. It's sort of about race in Boston in the 80s and early 90s when I was growing up there. It's sort of, I mean, it's a very different project that in some ways is more similar to a lot of the other books I've written, except in the form. So, I mean, the anguish and the finding of this form certainly unlocked for me or reminded me of the wide possibilities of this form. But I also think, and I think this is what you're asking, I think writing this book also sort of, you know, freed a certain kind of logjam and will make it easier for me to write stuff in the future that is sort of emotionally difficult and searing and probing and thorny and complicated going forward, which, you know, I consider myself sort of, I mean, I write a lot of things. At this point, I do more screenwriting than anything else. But at heart, I still think of myself as a novelist, but I haven't written a literary novel since before my brother died. That was what I did primarily for many years. And, you know, a lot of them do have those qualities. They were hard for me to write. They were emotionally difficult. There's all of this searching and seeking to get to the heart of the characters, the heart of the conflict. And it's something I haven't done in a while. And I feel more capable of getting back into that kind of work, having written this book. Although another project that I'm working on right now, I actually adapted this book for the screen, wrote a screenplay that's sort of very loosely based on it, is a very liberal adaptation in that it takes this book and it reimagines it in a very different way. But that project is moving forward. So immediately after writing this book, I did sort of like rewrite this book as a screenplay, if that makes sense.
And
Great,
with
thank you.
that, it's about 1:23. It's probably as good time to wrap up as any. Adam, this was a great Luncheon Society. I mean, this is a tough subject for people to really embrace and handle and deal with, and you've done it with an extraordinary amount of style and grace. And it's quite clear that you were able to do it in a way that you're able to put your honest feelings out there. And that's often not seen within publishing, or if it is, it's hidden away in some alcove of a bookstore nobody really gets to see. So thank you very much. And I'll after the email, after this, I'll email you so that we get the book plates and all that stuff going. As usual, per usual, I'll take care of the books, all that stuff will be all sent out to everybody. Again, we have Jeffrey Garten coming up next month. Andre Kudrescu will be coming up at a time to be named later. He's a lot of fun. He's also, this is one of the things about the Luncheon Society, he's a lot more fun when he's in person, because then there's drinking involved. And then it's like when we used to have Christopher Hitchens come to the Luncheon Society years ago. The luncheon didn't begin until we were on a pub crawl through San Francisco or Los Angeles. And then we were never so thankful for public transportation in our lives. And then we have a good space one coming up. We have a good science one coming up, a fun political one coming up, and and one about film, which will be coming up too. So again, I want to thank everybody for coming. This was a great gathering. Adam, thank you so much for your humanity. Everybody, thanks for coming, and stay tuned.
Thank you.
All right, gang. Take care, everybody.